Want your brand to be seen and be remembered? Effective campaigns need both. JCDecaux's high-quality billboard sites in premium locations nationwide offer brands powerful and visible stages for emotive, impactful and influential storytelling. Find out how JCDecaux can help your brand be seen and be remembered at www.beseenberemembered.co.nz. No mai hoki mai ki other fold, imahine ko Duncan Greive tōku ingoa, and welcome Glen Kyne back to the fold.
G'day Duncan, good to be here.
We haven't spoken in a while, and the big story, I think, or the most interesting thing to talk about that's happened in the intervening time has been two pieces of news that are really one piece of news out of New Zealand On Air, that they will be funding again Shortland Street for the 2026 season. And perhaps most notably, because that was a re-up of what they did this year, that Celebrity Treasure Island and the Traitors New Zealand have both received funding from New Zealand On Air for the first time. It's not it's not the whole of the package. It's about, I think they've funded roughly 1.5 million for each of those shows, but those were previously fully commercially funded. Both TVNZ and 3 respectively said we're not in a position to fund those fully commercially anymore. So New Zealand On Air has kind of taken it upon itself, or it's heard the argument and accepted the argument that they're the only way that those shows will stay on screen. Let's start with the decision around the reality TV shows. What did you make of it?
Unsurprised. I think that there's been a lot of signals from, Sparta and the production community that they have been lobbying government and New Zealand On Air for some time to be able to get relief around seeing what historically have been termed formats, very commercial formats that wouldn't get funding, that they need help in this area. It's further demonstration of the deterioration of our sector, or the broadcasting sector, and the inability for the broadcasters to be able to outrightly and directly fund these projects in their totality. And the interesting thing about all of this is when you've got an industry in decline, with revenues in decline, you can't spend as much money, which often means that the quality of content is not the same, and it becomes this death spiral to the bottom. This decision, to some degree, alleviates that to a point, but we still don't know, based on where the structural trends are, where this is all going to end up, obviously into the future, and when, and how quickly the new digital model can pick up. So I feel like, we were just talking off screen, I feel like there's this continuum of movement that's happening at the moment on the New Zealand On Air funding decisions, and we can get into the details of that in a little bit. And then there's a big question around, these two reality formats in particular. What's different about these two potentially compared to other formats, on screen?
Yeah, I think so. So what we'll do is we'll talk about the kind of the detail, and I guess the thing that interests me is the sort of incentives and potentially the moral hazard that has been opened up with this decision. And then in the back half, you've been looking hard at the New Zealand On Air investment strategy, of which this is kind of connected as in terms of the decisions, and we'll sort of probe that and see what it sort of suggests about where we're headed and what the future challenges are. Because I do think that the whole New Zealand On Air model is in some way, like, there's only so much they can do in terms of what they're laid out, what they're tasked with doing without any kind of major structural change, which would ultimately have to happen at government level.
Yep.
That it's beyond them themselves. So I wrote a piece about this last week, and I think, if I'm honest, I think on balance it's the correct decision that these, I used to host a podcast about reality TV, so clearly I think that it's an interesting and entertaining format, and a lot of the time there is more to these shows than the log line would suggest.
Mm-hmm.
That Celebrity Treasure Island in particular, and against all odds, like, let's be honest, this show looks like it should be something that's totally facile and that has no nutritional content whatsoever. and yet they've managed to, and I think this is credit to the makers and to TVNZ as well for sort of finding a way to thread the needle between having interesting kind of culture and language components and certainly like a really interesting and entertaining, quite diverse cast while still making it a compulsive viewable show. And
it creates that show in particular, those characters each have a character arc of their own that whose stories are told off broadcast.
Yeah,
there's a lot of narrative that happens, off screen.
That's right. And there's with shows like this, there's something kind of really interesting and kind of hard to pin down. You can find yourself feeling like you're almost, you're explaining. You're casting around for a reason to fund something when you say that when you put a bunch of, there's some former league and union stars go on there, and that's fine. It's nice for them. It's good to see them again. But when you put like a Lance Savali or a Joe Damon on the show, they get a different level of exposure there, and they get put into a kind of a mainstream audience that they, as successful as they've been in social formats, that it probably brings new opportunities to them. So there is a bit of an ecosystem argument. It's the same thing, I felt when we lost the project, that, and I wrote about that at the time, that the project is a show, but it's also a vehicle for promoting a whole bunch of other things that New Zealand really needs to be able to sort of, to hear about.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, isn't it? All reality TV shows to some degree provide a platform for the contestants along some other mission that they carry. And, at the one extreme, you've got Married at First Sight, and that could be contestants wanting to launch a new range or something, launch a book, whatever it might be. On the other end of the spectrum, some of the names you're naming, they talk about the platform to raise awareness, social cohesion issues, other things that might be going on in our society. And that's one of the interesting things about reality television is the broad spectrum of it. But it does act absolutely as a platform for those contestants.
Yeah, and so then Traitors, maybe not quite the same extent. Like that show works best when it is ordinary people rather than celebrities, and where they're less sort of in the game. But it's a very entertaining format. It's popular and
needs a new host.
It does need a new host. You available? So there's definitely, and the arguments I think have been well canvassed around the why for those shows. There's also the sort of, it keeps the platforms, being the channels and the digital platforms that host them, it gives them months of content that is returnable, that gets people showing up once a week, that kind of keeps the thing afloat. So it cuts for both individuals and for the kind of media platforms themselves.
And these shows also, by the way, sorry Duncan, they do particularly well, or equally as well, I should say, in a digital environment as they do on linear.
Yeah, so let's talk a bit about the ratings. So I asked both TVNZ and 3 for ratings across 25 to 54, 5+, and digital, and they were kind enough to release those to me. So I'll just quickly run through them, and then we can sort of talk about the story that it's told there. Because particularly with Celebrity Treasure Island, it's we've got 6 seasons running from 2019 to 2024. So you can see the average audience for 5+ ran 264,000, 299,000. That's in 2021. That was they had the good fortune, misfortune for Auckland of running during the lockdown of 2021, and that season was a fantastic one. It was won by Chris Parker with kind of an incredible, unscriptable finale.
Yep.
But I think that is almost like the perfect case for for this, in that it was great television. It had all these kind of great flow, and it was really well viewed. It was something that kind of kept you. I don't know. It felt like it connected you to the country at a time when you were stuck at home, and that lockdown was interminable up here. Thereafter, it does kind of plateau. 22 it was 177,000, 23 180,000, there were actually 2 seasons in 23. There's Fans versus Faves and a normal season. That was 191,000 and then 194,000. So there's a slight upward trend there, but nothing compared to what the first 2 sort of pandemic or pre-pandemic and then peak pandemic seasons were. The 25 to 54 story is more troublesome, I suppose, because you look at where it started in 2019, 264,000, where it ended in 2024, 194,000, and 5+. That's a relatively gentle decline from point to point. 25 to 54, it started with 146,000. Now, to give you some context, that would be probably there or thereabouts the number 1 show in 25 to 54 as of now. That's the news, that's country calendar, those or maybe a really, really significant game of rugby are the only shows that can get to that kind of range now. The lockdown season, 162,000, but thereafter it basically halves. So from that point on, we go 78,000, 69,000, 94,000 and 80,000. Those are all average audience numbers. So you do see that it mirrors the decline of linear television more broadly, particularly accelerated in the post-pandemic era. So I'll do the TVNZ Plus. So this is the effectively, I'll do the total streams number because they do show the sort of scale of the audience expanding. 18 episodes that were streamed, in 2019, you had 18 episodes streamed 684,000 times. The next season, the lockdown season, 2.4 million times across 27 episodes. That season was a real supernova and one that's unlikely to be repeated. Thereafter, 27 episodes, 1.8 million, 15 episodes, 1 million, 18 episodes, 1.5 million, 18 episodes, 1.8 million. Broadly, they're getting about 100,000 viewers on streaming. So if you look at the total combined audience, whether that's the 25 to 54 or the 5+, along with the streaming audience, that's actually a pretty consistent rating. And in this era, that's kind of amazing. That they have built this brand, this had no right to even be on screen's brand, into something that is really quite substantial.
Yeah, that's right. And it's not, and I'm certainly not critical here when I say this, but the unfortunate thing is whilst that streaming performance is fantastic, it's still not covering the loss of that linear, which is kind of where we're hoping to get to, right? That we start to see streaming get to a scale that actually it supersedes the decline in linear audience.
And I think that's the thing, right? Like we always talked about this digital transition. We would go from linear to digital, and hopefully, eventually, that we'd turn off the switch on linear, and everyone who was there would be on the linear, the digital platform. That hasn't proven to be the case. As soon as you're on digital, you've got way more options, and you end up doing a bunch of different stuff. So it's a significantly smaller audience.
The other interesting thing about those numbers for me, Duncan, that show in particular is very, I guess there's a direct relationship to viewership based on the contestants in the show and their, the public's kind of pre-show with those individuals and kind of how they go on the journey with them. It's quite unique in that way.
It's the reason why film is all pre-existing IP, right?
That's right.
That when you're bringing this fresh batch of celebrities, you get a big bomb when you announce the cast, and that anyone who's a super fan of any of those celebrities will, they've got 18 different paths into watching the show. So it's a great format. Credit to Julie Christie and iWorks way back in the day. So the Traitors has only run 2 seasons. The total streaming numbers, the arc looks good, 463,000 for the first, 657,000 for the second, but still dwarfed by what CTI is doing. 5+, the viewership's not so good, 172,000 in 23 and 24 down to 120,000. And in 25 to 54, 2023, we saw 83,000 viewers. 2024, for 57,000. So it's while that was a very acclaimed show, particularly on the spin-off, I should say, it didn't necessarily, and the format is huge, it didn't necessarily deliver the same kind of numbers of Celebrity Treasure Island. That said, 3 does have a smaller audience.
Yep.
So it's a hard thing, right? If you don't fund these shows, this was part of the argument that Cam Harlan made. We'll still get the Traitors, but it'll be the Traitors Australia, the Traitors USA, the Traitors UK, and that function of seeing our voices, accents, language, cultures on screen, that can go through these shows, and it just won't otherwise.
Yeah, that's right. And there is, I mean, I'm not suggesting at all for this format that this would be the reality, but there is a reality actually that the sellers of these formats just look at New Zealand and say, no, we're not going to bother. And actually we start to lose actually those international versions of things as well because it's too hard. And so, there is underlying these decisions, and I think, as you said, it is the right decision at this point in time to support these formats. It belays a much bigger issue that continues, to confront broadcast media.
So before we move on, I do want to get to the counter argument to it, and this is what I wrote about, is that all of the slates are challenged. We saw that so viscerally last year with news. When we lost News Hub, a bit earlier we'd lost the Project. We had Sunday, we had Fair Go. All of them sort of vanished within a 6-month period. And I guess this is the thing that I struggle with a bit, because there was a lot of consternation about that, but there wasn't really a sense that though there was a fight to save them from the networks. And I realized that you were there for some of this, and I'd love you to speak to it. But partly why they seem to have fought for these in a different way is because they are commercially viable in a different way, which is to say that Celebrity Treasure Island is filled with integration. Like McDonald's is a big part of the prize packages, and you can't do integrations on the news. And in fact, it was telling that the TVNZ news shows which were saved, which were viable, were Breakfast and 7 Sharp, both of which have a lot more integration opportunities. And I guess that's the moral hazard, is that I sort of look at New Zealand On Air, which has this very public media mandate, and it has now ended up funding shows which have seemingly a more marginal public media case than the ones which were left to fall, and that's because they're funding things which are more commercial than than the alternative. I don't know. How do you think about all that stuff?
Well, first of all, I don't know the terms of the agreement with New Zealand On Air and CTI in particular to know whether there's been any limitations or kind of ring fencing or how that came about. But you're right, it is a commercial format. In terms of integration, it's probably not the biggest format out there.
It's not the block.
It's not the block. And there's a continuum, but it still does attract partners and sponsors into the show. Traitors, not so much. It doesn't really allow for that as much, although they will have production partners in place to bring down the cost of production. But on a moral level, you do look at it, and I think back to, when we made the decision to close News Hub, and not long thereafter, TVNZ closed Fair Go and Sunday. And it's kind of this judgment question to go, what show is more valuable in the public eye that could be potentially funded? Now, I don't think going back to those days there was an opportunity necessarily to fund those shows directly, because the chaos that was kind of happening was happening so fast and so deep. The ability for New Zealand On Air, for example, to be able to react to that in a meaningful way was challenged, and TVNZ needed to get money out the door pretty quickly. And so, but on balance, as a public media strategy, would Sunday serve a purpose if it did have some level of funding to be on air today on our screens? I would posit yes. That's just a very personal view. And would I prefer to see that over some reality formats? Yes, but that's again, me, stage of life and other things.
I guess the point is that Sunday was not cratering from a ratings perspective. Sunday outrated both these shows combined.
Correct.
Maybe not so much on digital. I'm not familiar there, but certainly on linear, it remained just an absolute juggernaut.
And in terms of driving cultural narrative, it was enormous. What it did. For the news cycle of the week, it was incredible. Very good show.
Absolutely. The JCDecaux Billboard Network delivers quality reach via commanding sites to ensure your campaign is visible and impactful. With superior screen quality and premium locations, JCDecaux can help your campaign be seen and be remembered. Visit www.beseenberemembered.co.nz to learn more. I mean, we'll see where this goes. The other point I wanted to make is that they have now established that commercial formats can be funded through New Zealand On Air. And what's to stop them, I guess? Next year, ratings are down. Therefore, the revenue that you can generate through advertising and through integrations is down. So they ask for more money, and like that sort of seems almost inevitable. Like that's what the sort of arcs tell you, and yet there's definitely a moral hazard there. There's a paradox there that public money there'll be more public money to serve less people. And I guess that's what comes where we get to the investment strategy piece, because longer term, this doesn't look like a viable way to interact with an industry.
Yeah, I think we're at this critical juncture, aren't we, with the kind of ecosystem collapse of television happening, the rise of BVOD, the rise of YouTube, the rise of TikTok, et cetera, trends that have been in place for a long time, but commercial reality of those trends has really, hit home in the last 24 months. And I sense, and we'll get into the detail in a second, but I sense that with New Zealand On Air, they are somewhere on a continuum of movement where actually the historic goal of public funded content, and the majority of that coming through broadcasters, is needing to change, because going back to where the audiences are, you've just given us the numbers, right? The audiences aren't there anymore. And so telling New Zealand stories and funding New Zealand stories increasingly probably needs to become platform agnostic for New Zealand On Air. It then is the question around, well, what are the stories that are going to be told? What is the cost of those stories, and how do they get distributed in New Zealand? And I do believe that into the future you're going to see more funding, and no one's quite figured out this model yet, Duncan. We've spoken a little bit about it, but I do think you'll see more funding going into creator economy-led first stories that may not be as highly distributed, but they will be reaching audiences still around the way that they want to engage with them. So I think there's this continuum, and I think what you've seen is New Zealand On Air reacting to a moment in time. I suspect begrudgingly. I don't know that. I haven't spoken to them, but I imagine that there was a lot of discussion around these two shows in particular, and Shortland Street. Shortland Street, if you take that out of the ecosystem in New Zealand, that's a lot of jobs gone, and those jobs don't come back.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because the New Zealand On Air is not a work scheme.
No.
That's not what it's for. And that's where you get into the ecosystemic argument, because if you don't have Shortland Street operating, you don't have any kind of talent development pathway.
Writers.
Writers, directors, actors, grips. The whole thing doesn't have a chance to then go on to other shows. So, again, you're making arguments that are esoteric to audience in some ways.
That's right.
But ultimately, that's where you get into this whole thing could collapse without some of these support. Without support for some of these structural elements.
Yeah, and I think New Zealand On Air this year, these decisions are purely based on pragmatism. But you're right, if we see this year after year and this increases, it does raise the question around actually, are we just actually covering up the real problems here, and is there a bigger issue that needs to be addressed that can't be addressed by New Zealand On Air? It has to be addressed through, some sort of structural implementation from government.
So tell me about the New Zealand On Air strategy. What do you see in there, and how does it interact with decisions like these, and what are we likely to see? Because the creator economy thing is something I've talked about in this podcast for a while. they don't. It's still a pretty small to non-existent almost part of what they do, and in some ways you can say, well, the creator economy exists and there's a lot of it. Whether it's thriving or not is a sort of a separate question. So the case for it as as needing investment isn't necessarily as there, but it's certainly there is audience interest in it. So, tell me about the New Zealand Air strategy.
Yeah, well, a couple of things. So they are constrained to some degree by the Broadcasting Act. The Broadcasting Act obviously outlines what they do.
1989.
1989, under review, I believe. I'm not sure exactly where that review is at, but we shall see. One of the interesting things is what they won't fund. And let me just read out a couple of things to you, Duncan. So this is certain projects from New Zealand On Air not eligible for funding. So these include scripted and non-fiction projects seeking completion funding without securing platform investment. Platform investment being, in these cases, we're talking about the networks, 3 and TVNZ. That could be, though, YouTube. That could be TikTok. And so one of the interesting questions for me sitting here again on this continuum of funding is, are we going to see a format pop up in the not too distant future where the first window of where you see that content is YouTube, the second window might be on TVNZ, and then eventually onto TVNZ Plus. And so are we going to see these models start to come up into the future? I'm going to suggest yes. We are going to see more of that. Next one's interesting. We will not fund scripted and non-fiction projects that are assessed by staff to have a high probability of securing commercial funding. What do you think of that one?
Yeah, that's interesting, right? Because at least until a couple of years ago, I mean, manifestly, like both the Traitors and Celebrity Treasure Island aired last year. So at that point, they were commercially fundable, but they stopped. And I think that's the thing that gets really difficult is, and goes back to the moral hazard pieces. If you're in TVNZ and you want to buy something for 70 cents in the dollar and not $1 in the dollar, cancel it.
Yeah.
Because then the production company can go to New Zealand On Air and say, look, TVNZ can't afford this anymore. And to be clear, TVNZ is really struggling. Like, it wouldn't be a lie, but this is now established that anything that they have, which, by the way, does include news and any other local production, whether it's internal or external, the only thing that they need to do to establish that it is no longer commercial is either take it off air or go and say, we will take this off air. And that's obviously what's happened with Shorten Street, for example.
Yeah, and look, I guess one of the challenges I have with this is, again, I acknowledge the pragmatism of New Zealand On Air making the decision at the time they have, but it does shroud to some degree the real issue here. And I've said before on the show, using the TVNZ example, and it's unknown for 3, right, under Sky ownership, exactly how that will go into the future. But with TVNZ, the big underlying cost base sitting there is news. Mm. And that ain't changing anytime soon from anything we've seen. And, I've talked about that, is there a case for, RNZ and TVNZ from a news gathering point of view to combine forces and consolidate and bring down their costs? And would something like that actually enable ongoing investment in entertainment formats for TVNZ for a longer time? And these decisions, they have the possibility of shrouding, these issues. And so, yeah, it's a challenge. It's a challenge.
Yeah, it's really, really tricky. And I think that's the sort of the point I probably want to make in closing in a way is that I don't envy New Zealand Air this at all. I think that these are all bad choices. They're all opportunity costs. For every show they fund, there's probably 2 or 3 that they don't, and all of those have cases for them, and hopes and dreams, and sincere beliefs that they will attract big audiences to them. We'll just never know because they don't get made.
And they're also making decisions, Duncan, in isolation of any kind of coherent government policy around what do they want their media sector to look like.
Yeah, absolutely. I think government being both a big participant in the sector, often a critic of it, not without reason at times, but and for any kind of and to give the government some credit here, there are a lot of things that they might like to do that are now more difficult to do because there's the threat of tariffs to if
geopolitics
exactly
are real
geopolitics, which never used to be a consideration here. Particularly, there was some consideration around trade policy and if you were sort of favouring your own sector. I mean, none of these things are unsolvable.
And I also wonder whether there is a level of once bitten, twice shy for New Zealand On Air around getting back into kind of in-depth news and current affairs type funding because of what happened with the
Public Interest Journalism
Fund. And so, all of these things potentially playing out in the background.
Well, and I think that's if you were to kind of follow that chain down, New Zealand On Air can and does fund content, not just for 3 and TVNZ and for Sky Open, but also for the spin-off and Newsroom and NZME and stuff. And that argument that what was previously commercially viable is no longer, all of those organisations can make that same argument now. Yep. In fact, they can point to, layoffs, to, whether it's, shows that they've run, whether it's, investigative journalism, all kinds of things which they used to do, which they no longer do. And so now now that New Zealand On Air has established that what was once commercially fundable and is no longer viable there is open for business from New Zealand On Air, I do think that this will have been noted by the industry, and they will be recipients of arguments around a much broader range of sort of formats and types of content than just reality TV going forward.
There will be a lot of activity amongst the production community and potential platform partners at the moment.
Absolutely. Well, we'll no doubt be revisiting that, but thanks so much for coming up, Glenn, and we'll talk again more on it very soon, no doubt.
Good to see you, Duncan.
Seeing is not enough. With optimized data tools and insights, the JC2Co Billboard network helps brands be remembered. Dedicated to closing the loop between impression and action, JC2Co can help your campaign be seen and be remembered. Visit www.beseenberemembered.co.nz to learn more.